Now to Module 3. Excited to work through this material with you. I trust that you have already looked through the slides from mounts and thought about nominatives. Many students, when they begin intermediate Greek, need a quick review of elementary Greek just to remember the case endings, or when we get to verbs, the personal endings and so forth. And I trust that's helpful for you. And now on to thinking about the different ways in which each case is used. And that is going to be the goal of intermediate Greek. We know the difference between a noun and a verb and a participle and all the rest. Now we look at the various categories of each of the cases and the tense forms and so forth. That's exegesis, and that's what we are doing in intermediate Greek in working through Colossians. In this video presentation, I'm going to pray for us in just a moment. We'll look here at the chapter summaries and think about the teaching in Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer. We'll then give our attention to Colossians and some examples in Colossians of nominatives. We'll look at accordance a bit and a couple of graphs to think about both nominatives and vocatives. Then do a bit of text criticism in Colossians chapter 1, looking at P46 and Vaticanus. So let's pray together and ask God's blessing on our work here on nominatives in Module 3. Lord, strengthen students. I pray that you'll give them time and discipline of mind. Help them to understand the material. Help them to remember the difference between nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. Help them then to think about the various categories of nominatives. Help them to recognize these, free them from intimidation at the various ways the cases can be used, and give them confidence in your word. Give them discipline to get into it themselves. And I pray that you will give us greater affection for you as a result of this today, greater appreciation of Christ from this whole class, greater effectiveness in ministry. We ask in your Son's name, amen. Thinking then about the categories of nominatives. Nominatives are the most frequently occurring types of nouns, the cases of noun, and the subject nominative is the most frequent of those, just basic. It's the subject of a verb. Just as we did a bit in the previous video, I will do today and throughout the course, reading a bit of Greek text, pausing. If I don't pause long enough, stop the video presentation and read out loud yourself so that you can learn to read and pronounce Greek text. It just takes practice. There's no substitute for it. Let's begin then here with John 1:15. Ioannes marture peri autou. John testified about him. Ioannes marture peri autou. John, Ioannes, the subject of the verb, marture. John testified about him. And here the marture, historical present, translated with a past time idea. John testified concerning him. Very basic. Can be a proper name as the subject, could be a pronoun is the subject, or just a noun is the subject, as the textbook notes on page 53. Very common. Second category that we'll think about, the predicate nominative. The predicate nominative predicates something about the subject. It says something about that subject. So provides further information, complements the subject in some way. Here, John 1:14. Cha logos sarx egenita. The word became flesh. And notice that the predicate nominative does not have to agree in gender with the subject. And this differentiates it from the predicate adjective, which does have to agree in gender. So the predicate nominative does not. One thing that you will recognize is that there can be at times a number of nominatives in a sentence or even a clause. And so you have to decide which of these nominatives is the subject and which is the predicate nominative. Well, the subject can be differentiated, as Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer note on page 55, by a particular pecking order. If there is a pronoun, it is likely the subject. If there is no pronoun, look for the articular noun. It's likely the subject. Third would be a proper name. Look for a proper name, and it's likely the subject. So in that order, pronoun, articular noun, proper name, to identify the subject. And the others look for a predicate nominative or another type of nominative. And again, ha logos sarx agenita, the word became flesh. Ha logos. Neither of these is a pronoun, so we look to the articular noun, ha logos, the word became flesh. Ha logos then would be, yes, the subject, and sarx, the predicate nominative. The nominative of apposition, exegetically significant, and you can see it here. Paulos, doulos Christou Iesu. Doulos qualifying Paulos, bondservant Paul. Further explaining, clarifying, describing, identifying. Needs to be adjacent and match syntactically, obviously in the same case, referring to the same person or thing. And this is a category that is exegetically significant and can be helpful for us. We'll notice this in Colossians as well in a few moments. So those are the major uses of the nominative. Then there are some other uses of the nominative. These are less grammatically tied to the sentence itself or to a verb and its clause. You'll notice this as we progress here. First, the nominative of address. This comes to take the place of the vocative, which is the formal category of address. Over time, that begins to fade, and the nominative of address takes its place. In the plural, it's the same grammatical form. Here, hoi andres, and husbands, love your wives. Hoi andres, agapete tas gunaikos. Husbands, love your wives. Here, husbands, the ones being addressed. They are in the nominative here. And you'll see this in Colossians as well, especially in chapter 3. These nominatives, again, often act like vocatives, and in the plural, they're the same form, so they function in the same way. And the address nominative is used in direct discourse, in speech context, very similar to the vocative. The next category, appellation. This is used where a title comes to signify almost a proper name. And you can see it here in the example in Luke 15:21. Ugeti emi axios klethenai huiasu. Ugeti emi axios klethenai huiasu. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And son here has this sort of quality about it that it's almost titular. And the nominative of appellation has that idea to it. It's often used with verbs of naming or calling, and you can recognize its sense in Luke 15:21 here, and also as in John 13:13 that Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer note. Humes phoneteme ka didaskalos kai ha kurios You call me teacher and Lord. Here, this designation of calling and these titles almost as if they were proper names, just giving a sense of honor about them, or calling, special designation. The nominative absolute and the hanging nominative are independent of the clause or sentence, the absolute more so than the hanging nominative. The absolute is grammatically independent, and it's basic. It occurs in the introductions of letters, salutations, addresses. Paulos, doulos, theou. We saw Paulos, doulos in Romans 1:1 in the apposition, with doulos modifying Paulos. Here we see Paulos as the absolute. It's on its own. It's grammatically independent. This is true of terms like grace and peace that are listed in the nominative at the beginning of letters, and we'll see that in Colossians here in a few moments. So the absolute, grammatically independent. The hanging nominative, or the pendant nominative, is independent grammatically, but logically it's still related to the sentence. It's the logical rather than the syntactical subject at the beginning of a sentence. It is connected, but logically rather than grammatically. And it's often used for emphasis, as the textbook notes, pages 59 to 61, especially the top of page 61, and here Revelation 3:12. Ha nikon poieso auton stulon entonao tu theumu. The victor, the one conquering, I will make him. You can see auton here relates back to nikon, and this nikon is independent of poieso, and yet it's somewhat related. It's the logical subject. This one will be made into a pillar in the sanctuary of God. We'll think not only about nominatives here in a few moments in Colossians, but also the vocative, just the direct address. It designates a person in a formal way being spoken to, though, as we noted, very similar to the nominative of address. And if you call one the other, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Just recognize that this person or thing is being set apart as receiving verbal attention. That's the person being called out, being encouraged, various contexts. Well, let's look at Colossians here for a few moments. We have the Module 3 and 4 open book exercise here, and you'll complete this in toto in the next module. Here, just the nominatives that we are looking at, and we begin in Colossians 1:1 with the nominatives. And you see Paulos, and if you have the textbook open, names in the nominative at the beginning of sentences, or especially at the beginning of epistles. Nominative absolute, completely independent grammatically, but here obviously the writer Paulos, and then apostolos. Apostolos, the apposition, the title of Paul in a sense. Just as bondservant, he often calls himself or gives himself that title here, apposition, Paulos, apostolos. Timotheos and adelphos, similar pattern. Charis eirene. We've noted those kinds of terms also at the beginning of letters. They are not related syntactically or logically to the sentence. Nominative absolute. Colossians 1:15. Here we'll look at the great Christ hymn, Hos estin ekon. Hos, the pronoun here, or relative, preceding a verb of being, estin, and a nominative followed by a verb of being, akon. You want to look at Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer and think about that as well. If there is a nominative following a verb of being, it's almost always what? Well, go back and take a look at that. Look then at verse 16. Chati en auto ektiste ta panta, that in him the all was created. Entois uranois kai epitesges ta horata kai ta aorata, ete phranoi, ete kuriatetes, ete archai, ete exousiai, ta panta diatu kai eis auton ektistai. Notice here we have this series of 4 nominatives following ete. Ete thrano, ete kuriatetes, ete archai, ete exousiai. And these all follow ta aorata, the invisible things. You want to think about nominatives that are immediately adjacent and qualifying previous nominatives, and that will help you along. You can see Murray's book as well to note not only these but others and to make your decisions about what you think the best category for those nominatives would be. Look at Colossians 1:18 then. Kai autos estin he kephale, and he is he kephale. What kind of a nominative follows verbs of being? And we have that same pattern further in 1:18. Kos estin arche. Let's jump down to Colossians chapter 4. Notice all of the nominatives here in Colossians 4. This is where Paul is addressing a number of people and designating them in specific ways, and that's what the naming, the nominative case, does. There's one category that we have not seen yet, but I want to call our attention to it in verse 11. Kai Jesus ha legamenos justus. The legamenos cues how we should interpret justos, justice here, Jesus who is called justice, or Jesus who is called justice. When we have verbs of calling or naming, what kind of nominative are we thinking about there? One other nominative that is significant for us I want to note in verse 12. Aspositai humas Epaphras, we remember that from chapter 1, greets you, ha ex humon, who is one of you, doulos. How would doulos be used here? Well, some of the nominatives from Colossians and the vocatives from Colossians. Just provide these for you here. There's no need to designate these beyond just a vocative. There are no subcategories of vocatives. Just notice them. Wives, husbands, children, fathers, slaves. Again, similar here, right here, kurioi, douloi, pateris, the nominative plurals. Similar form exactly, in fact, to the vocative. So we don't want to split hairs with the plurals. Is this a nominative of address or is it a vocative? Just understand that group is being designated as those addressed. They are sort of in the seat. Could be a hot seat, could be a seat of appreciation. But either way, they are being addressed. nominatives and vocatives in Colossians there. I want to note with you some patterns here in accordance. Here are the nominatives, both nouns and pronouns, you can see in Colossians. And notice how much more frequently they occur toward the end of the book. Again, that's because Paul there is addressing the various individuals, and you can imagine in other epistles that he does this sometimes at the beginning, sometimes at the ending. Another place that we could look is Romans toward the end, a number of nominatives in that long series of greetings that Paul gives at the end there. So just a pattern for us to keep in mind. Let's change our designation here for a moment. And let's look at vocatives. Just the vocatives. And let's broaden our range a bit and think about these in the Gospels for a moment. I want you to see how the vocative in the Gospels occurs in places where there is direct speech going on. Here, Jesus on trial. Look how frequently the vocative occurs toward and Jesus on trial, but also Matthew 23, Jesus addressed to the Pharisees here. His address to them, look how spiked the vocatives are there. You may want to think about that as you do a study of Matthew. Luke, similar patterns toward the end a bit with Jesus on trial. John 17, John 13 here, with Jesus addressing his disciples, and then toward the end as well. Let's do the same with vocatives in the epistles. You can see here some interesting configurations as well and patterns. Places where Paul is very sharp with the Galatians in addressing them, and you can see that here, chapter 6 especially. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians help us to remember that the vocative is not always a sharp address. It can be a term or just a rather grammatical phenomenon that endears one person to another or notes that special connection already in addressing them. And Paul's warm tone toward the Thessalonians, both in 1st Thessalonians and in 2nd Thessalonians, Paul's continual greetings to them. James likewise, adelphoi. That becomes a function, rhetorical structural marker in James when he addresses them as brothers, adelphoi. Well, trust that you're enjoying Accordance. If you haven't purchased it yet, I encourage you to think about that. And this kind of a tool can be especially helpful for you in exegesis. Let's think about Colossians just a bit further here. I have pulled up a PDF of my Greek text, and Colossians chapter 1, I want to look with you here at verse 16 and some textual criticism. We looked at the thronoi, kyriatetis, archai, exousiai, modifying ta or ata, the invisible things. We have thought about some other instances of nominatives here in Colossians, but I want to think just about text criticism for a few moments, and especially down here, this mark. Eta thronoi, eta kyriatetis, eta archai, eta exousiai, ta panta diautu kai es auton ektistai. The perfect verb here, all through him and for him. And we look at this mark in verse 16, we go down to verse 16, and then we go to this mark here, and P46 has chati there instead of ta. hoti, that or because, all through him and for him. The word hoti is extremely flexible and would begin here in the mind of the scribe P46 to begin this clause, because the all through him and for him was made, or an explanatory hoti, that is, the all through him or for him is some kind of an emphatic idea. But hoti in P46, let's take a look at that here for just a moment. Pulling up P46 again from Center's Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and P46 resides, these are just photos, but it resides in the Chester Beatty collection of papyri, University of Manchester. And here we have Colossians 1:16, exousiai, right there. And I'm pulling over archai, and then the manuscript is torn here, but you can see exousiai, hoti, not ta, but hoti panta. It may be that the scribe understood hoti to be there instead of ta, or it could be that he was looking at the omicron and the iota in thranoi, and it looked to him at that moment like hoti, or it could be because of hoti earlier in verse, jumping back here in the beginning of verse 16. Hoti enauto and hoti panta would be a nice frame, and perhaps that's what he understood it to be. But if we go to Vaticanus, and we pull up here Vaticanus, finding my place, thranoi, ete kurioi, archai, ete exousiai, right there, ta panta, not hoti, but ta, where P46 has hoti. So there's a bit of textual criticism, and P46 the lone witness there, so likely the scribe misread from here or was thinking of the earlier hoti here at the beginning of verse 16. Well, that is our presentation for Module 3, looking at the nominatives and vocatives, some textual criticism as well. Press on in your initial exegesis here of Colossians, and going through and looking at the nominatives and beginning to categorize them. Keep up on vocab, and next week we will look at the accusatives here in Module 4, and be back in Colossians as well. All the best to you.